Hello and welcome, my name is Retro and today we will be covering Zephyr. Now I haven't played Zephyr a lot until I started testing her to play this build. In fact, if you remember my tier list video I uploaded quite a while ago, on that tier list I had a tier that said haven't played as much, and there was probably only like maybe 5 or 6 Warframes in that tier. It was basically just I haven't played these Warframes a lot and don't want to rate them on minimal information. And Zephyr was in that tier. So this build, although I have played with Zephyr before, I mostly just leveled her and threw her in the Helminth. So this testing her for this build was really the first time I actually gave her a good whirl, and she is definitely very good. So let's get into her kit, and afterwards I'll of course explain my build for her. Her passive will give her decreased gravity. This basically means that she falls slower than other Warframes. Additionally, she will gain a additive crit chance buff to her weapons when she's in the air of 150%. It's meant to be additive, but I've actually found a bug with her passive, the crit chance buff, that I'll talk about in more detail when we get to her 4th ability, because it is specifically related to her 4th ability. She does have an augment for her passive, which is like Excalibur Umbra's augment, Nezha's augment, other similar Warframes. It turns off the lesser gravity effect from her passive while increasing her ability strength by 15%. And this is a Xless mod, so you can put it in the Xless mod slot. And Zephyr's first ability is called Tailwind. Tailwind basically just gives her some aerial maneuvers. It's nothing really that special. It does cost half energy though when you activate it while in the air. Activating the ability will just pull Zephyr forward and launch her through the air. Enemies that she passes will take a minimal amount of damage. If you aim at the ground when you cast this ability, you will dive on, and there will be a small AoE explosion doing little damage to enemies in range. You can hold the ability though, which will make Zephyr float in air while draining energy over time. The augment for this ability will reset your bullet jump each time you activate the ability. Additionally, it will increase the damage the ability does by 100% for each enemy hit by it, and then this increased damage does get reset when you've been on the ground for 2 seconds. Her second ability is called Air Burst. Tapping the ability will group enemies together within 8 meters, scaling with range. Hold casting ability, however, will make enemies fly out within 8 meters, of course, once again scaling with range. It does do a tiny bit of IPS damage with a 50% status chance, but it will also apply both knockback and ragdoll to enemies, which are 2 invisible stat effects. The augment for this ability will give you a 40% base damage buff to pistols and only pistols for each enemy hit for 14 seconds. It does cap out at 500% as it's 40% per enemy hit. So if you hit enough enemies, you'll get a 500% base damage buff to pistols. The amount of damage you get per enemy hit is affected by ability strength, but the cap is not affected by ability strength. And of course, the 14-second duration is also affected by ability duration. Zephyr's third ability is called Turbulence. Zephyr will create a field around herself that will nullify all damage from bullets that enter it. The enemies do not need to be in or out of the field when firing the bullets to affect it. As long as the bullet travels through the field at one point, the damage from the bullets will be nullified. Visually, the bullets are redirected, and the ability's description in-game says the bullets are redirected from you, but I am specifically saying the damage from the bullets are nullified, because you can have an enemy standing literally right next to you trying to shoot you, and you will not take any damage. Additionally, it does not matter if the bullets are aimed at Zephyr or not, meaning if they were aimed at another player, one of your allies, but they happen to go through the turbulent field, the damage the bullet will have done will still be nullified. It also means that you do see the bullets get flying off in random directions, and since the damage from the bullets are nullified, on the off chance that a bullet gets redirected at an enemy, at an ally, they won't take any damage from the bullet. However, it does not stop melee attacks, nor does it stop abilities from acolytes or Eximus units, most notably, and it does not stop AoE damage. The augment for Turbulence will give Zephyr and allies within range a movement speed buff as well as a projectile speed buff. Her fourth ability is Tornado. Zephyr will spawn 3 tornadoes. The way the spawning for the tornadoes works is it will have a range, quite a large range, centered on wherever you point your aiming reticle. The tornadoes will be able to spawn anywhere within this range, but they will prioritize spawning on top of enemies. The tornadoes will then roam around the map, grouping enemies together within 10 meters. The group is not affected by ability range, but the spawn range is. Enemies that grouped into it will be ragdolled and will be carried along by the tornado. Shooting the tornado will redirect any of your damage at any enemy within the range of the tornado's pool. Enemies do not actually need to be affected by the pool to have the damage redirected at them. Meaning, if an Acolyte or an Eximus unit with Overguard or any other unit with Overguard happens to be in the pool radius of a tornado, but isn't currently being pulled by the tornado because they're immune to crowd control, the damage from your bullets will still be redirected to them if you shoot at the tornado. The redirected damage will carry over all your critical shots as well as the status effects that your weapon is doing. Additionally, the damage will apply a 2x multiplicative crit damage buff. This means your mods will apply, giving increase in your crit damage, and then the tornadoes will apply an additional 2x critical damage buff on top of that, multiplicatively, not additively. The bug for her passive does come to play here with her tornadoes. When I was build testing this build, I noticed that my Laden, which is the weapon I am using for DPS, was orange critting while in the air with the crit chance buff. However, the critical chance I should have been getting with Laden should have only been around 88%, meaning I should have not been getting orange crits. Additionally, I was not proccing the Laden's 5th evolution of Roman Attrition, which only procs on non-critical hits and while that also don't apply status effects. And I wasn't proccing that at all, which suggested to me that the passive was giving me a crit chance above 100%, which it should have not been. This led to further testing, and I am unsure if it's applying the buff from the passive twice, so you're actually getting a 300% additive buff, or if it's applying the buff from the passive multiplicatively, which would mean, say, if you take critical delay, for example, which gives a 200% crit chance buff, it would increase your crit chance on your weapon by 200%, and then the passive would then increase it separately by 150%. So it's either just applying the passive twice or it's applying it multiplicatively, I'm not sure. Either way, it's bugged because it shouldn't be doing either. This only works when you shoot into the tornadoes. It won't work normally, and it doesn't seem to work on bows for some reason, but it did work on every other weapon I tried it on except Incarnate forms. So it does not work on Laden's Incarnate. I also tried it on Strun. It worked on Strun's normal fire, but it did not work on Strun's Incarnate form. It did not. I used the Dread Incarnate because I thought it would work on a bow. It didn't work on either the Incarnate form or the normal fire from the bow. So it doesn't work on bows. It does work on beam weapons. I tried it with Lieutenant Glaxon. Does work on pistols and does work on shotguns, and I assume it works on assault rifles. I didn't actually test an assault rifle, but I assume it does because it worked on a beam weapon, and they're pretty similar, really. The tornado will also do a small amount of IPS damage over time to any enemy that is grouped within them. Shooting into the tornado will change the damage it does to whatever the strongest elemental damage your weapon does. So if your weapon does more cold damage, for example, than anything else, the tornadoes will no longer do IPS, instead they will do cold damage. Once you've changed them to an elemental damage, they cannot change back to any of the IPS damages, but you can change the damage they do still. So if you shoot a pistol and it does cold damage, and then you use your primary that does radiation, and it does more radiation than the pistol did cold damage, it will change to radiation, as an example. Hold casting ability will make the tornadoes stationary, as stopping them from moving around. It will also make the tornadoes spawn around the area of your reticle, because the spawn radius is actually quite big, especially if you're modding for range, which we are. It can be very big, and the tornadoes can spawn far away from you as they spawn on wherever enemies are. But if you hold cast the ability, you'll ensure that the tornadoes spawn in an area that you actually want them to spawn in. The augment will give you 8 additional tornadoes, giving your total 11 tornadoes. However, their size will be reduced by 50%, and they will no longer group enemies. They will no longer have that pool effect. However, if enemies are ragdoll, they will be sucked into the tornadoes. enemies will have damage that are enemies within the tornadoes that have been ragdolled and then grouped by the tornadoes will still be applied the normal damage redirection, but they do not seem to work the same as the tornadoes do without the augment, where even if enemies aren't actually being affected by the crowd control of the tornado, they still get the damage redirection. Enemies were not getting the damage redirection if they weren't actually grouped by the tornado. So you had to ragdoll them first, most prominent with your second ability, then have the tornadoes group them if you were using the augment to apply the redirection. It wasn't working otherwise with my tests, which is why I'm not using the augment. For the build, I opted to set up a basic build, a camping style build that would use the hold cast from a fourth ability to group enemies and suck them in the tornado, and I'll be able to use the second ability for the much larger group to pull enemies in from a larger range to get them sucked in the tornado. Then I simply just shoot the tornado with my weapon, have it apply my status effects and the damage it does, and have all the enemies in the tornado die. I am using the Laden because of some synergies it has with it, but I am also using the augment for her second ability to give me that 500% base damage buff for pistols, which is another reason why I'm using the Laden, as it is a pistol. I am not using the Incarnate form for the Laden. Not only does this bug, which does actually increase the DPS of our build, as it applies the passive hit twice or multiplicatively, which proves to be better than additive, just a simple once additive apply. Not only does that not apply on the Incarnate form for the Laden, but also the Incarnate form no longer does slash, where the non-Incarnate form does, and we want to be doing slash DPS damage over time from bleeding effects with this build. The Helminth was actually very hard to pick from, as I am running a negative strength build, which is pretty typical for Zephyr, and there aren't a lot of good Helminth options that don't need strength. The most obvious solution would have been Raw, but Raw needs strength. But also I feel like adding a damage buff like Raw is unnecessary for this build. I tried checking out Silence, as Eximus units, their abilities will go through your third ability, which is very annoying. And Silence turned off Eximus abilities, and that was good, but because of the stun from Silence, it did slow down my KPM by quite a bit. So instead, I opted for Spellbound, which is Titania's Helminth ability, which will give Zephyr status immunity, which helps out with the whole Eximus unit issue, and it also gives me some knockback immunity. However, it isn't as necessary, as we will actually be getting Overguard from our second, but as we will be using melee fortification, and I will explain why when we get to the secondary build. So once we get Overguard, we won't actually need to be casting Spellbound anymore. So Spellbound is really only useful before we have Overguard, or when the Overguard breaks, to prolong our status immunity. Honestly, there's just no other good Helminth that actually has some synergy with this build that doesn't need strength. So this is what we were left with. Fortunately for me, the Zephyr is very, very easy to mod for, and she doesn't need survivability, nor does she need any energy economy, because I'm using Mystic Bond on my companion. For the most part, she doesn't need any energy economy. So I could go nuts when it came to modding for duration and range. So I am running max range with overextended reach and stretch. And I am almost running max range with Augur Message, Constitution, Primed Continuity, and Multi-Efficiency, giving me 265 range, and then not 207. 207 is just Constitution, Primed Continuity, and Augur Message. It does not factor in the 38% in addition to that 207% we get from more efficiency. We would have so we would actually be getting 243% ability duration. Additionally, I do have Air Burst, which is of course the augment for our second ability, and the last slot I have modded Umbral Intensifier just to increase our strength. None of her abilities scale of strength except for the augment from her second ability, and it only scales of strength for the damage increase per enemy. I can still get the 500% damage increase cap with negative strength, but I figured I'd just put on a tiny little bit of strength to effectively lower the amount of enemies I need to hit with the second to get the cap. But it's not necessarily needed. Honestly, this is kind of a flex spot, and you could put on any mod you wanted. I do have Aerodynamics just because it fits with her kit, giving you that damage reduction around the air, but she doesn't need it because of her third ability, and you will But also her base polarity for the aura slot is Vazarin, so I just went for it because of that. She doesn't really need anything from survivability, as she will be having status immunity from Spellbound or from the Overguard. All bullets fired at her will be the damage will be nullified. The Overguard will help protect you against the Xmas abilities, and any enemy that could melee you won't get close enough to you, as they'll be grouped by your tornadoes and your second ability. And then the last arcane I am using is Arcane Velocity, as it will give my secondary a 90% crit chance, a 90% chance to increase its fire rate by 120% for pistols on each critical hit. DE added this accessibility setting in the recent update. Fire manual triggered weapons continuously. I understand why they added this, and it was a pretty good addition to the game for accessibility reasons. However, it basically means semi-auto weapons don't exist anymore, which is why the Cannonade mods were introduced, as it was their attempt to still make semi-auto weapons a thing. However, the Cannonade mods need to be give a lot bigger buffs if DE actually wants people to use them, instead of just modding for fire rate on the weapon. But it's a shame that this honestly really good accessibility setting is just going to be abused. And yes, I am the person abusing it for this build, as I have turned the Laden, which is meant to be a slow firing semi-auto pistol, into a full auto pistol. The non-incarnate form, I mean. Because I can just hold now, and the weapon will fire consecutively. I get 120% fire rate from Arcane Velocity. I get an additional 20% fire rate from its second evolution. And I have Lethal Torrent that gives me an additional 60% fire rate from 60% fire rate, working up to be 200% fire rate in total, meaning the weapon shoots very fast. And this is meant to be a semi-auto pistol. The other evolutions I have are the gain 70% ammo efficiency while aim gliding, or sliding. This is very, very needed because of how quickly the Laden is firing. And since this basically means that we only consume one ammo every 2.5 shots, and since our magazine capacity has been increased to 17 through mods, because it's normally only 12, this does mean that our ammo capacity while aim gliding is technically 42.5. If you're wondering how consumes ammo over 2.5 shots works, it's pretty simple. The first ammo consumption is only consumed on your second shot, and then the second ammo consumption is consumed on your third shot, and then it goes back to your second shot, then third shot, and then it just repeats like that. The fourth evolution, it doesn't do anything for this build. You don't want to be running Elemental Excess, because we will be using Overwhelming Attrition, which is a crit laden build. We will not be using Devouring Attrition. Both of these work off headshots, and we won't be getting headshots, as enemies will be ragdolled in a ball in the air thanks to our tornadoes. For the fourth ability, as I said, we'll be using Overwhelming Attrition, not Devouring Attrition. Not only is it just better generally, it's also better especially for Zephyr, because it makes use of the crit chance buff from her passive and the double crit damage from her fourth ability. And this one just doesn't do anything. If you don't know how Overwhelming Attrition works, basically it procs whenever you have a non-critical hit that does not apply status effects, and it gives you a 400% base damage buff for 10 seconds, and it stacks 3 times, so it can give you up to a 1200% base damage buff. This is better than Devouring Attrition, as although you need to get non-critical hits to actually proc the buff, it does then, once procced, apply to your critical hits. So once it's procced, you get that 1200% base damage buff to your critical hits. Devouring Attrition not only is inconsistent, as it only has a 50% chance, and only works on critical hits, so if you do get a crit hit, it's not going to work at all, only works on that shot that you fired. It is a 2000% final damage buff, but since it doesn't work with crits, as it won't proc on critical hits, overall nutrition does actually work out to be better. For the build, we of course have our multi-shot with Galvanized Diffusion, and we will have Galvanized Shot for the status chance and the Gun CO. For Laden, both its incarnate form and non-incarnate form, Gun CO is additive. We have Stunning Speed, which gives us more status chance and reload speed. Creeping Bullseye for the crit chance, but we do lower our fire rate, so we actually only get 180% fire rate, not the full 200%. Ice Storm for the magazine capacity and the cold damage. Our critical damage, more fire rate, and multi-shot and pistol elementalist for more reload speed, and status damage for our slash, because we will be applying slash on enemies. Ice Storm is being used more so than Split Magazine, as Split Magazine only gives you a 30% magazine capacity increase, while Ice Storm gives you a 40%, so it actually gives you more. And it does give us cold damage as well, so we can apply the cold status effect, which will further buff our crit damage. We are using Secondary Fortify, not any of the Acolyte Arcanes, because we get a 1,200% base damage buff from overall nutrition. We get a further 500% base damage buff, giving us a total of 1,700 base damage buff from Zephyr's second augment. And then we have Gun CO, which is also additive with base damage, so adding even more additive base damage is really not going to do anything for this build. This does increase the damage to our enemies with Overguard, meaning it is actually a multiplicative damage buff to enemies with Overguard. It also does end up giving us Overguard, which does help us deal with Acolytes, but overall it isn't really needed because we're immune to damage most of the time. We are using a Hound for this build. Run whatever components you want, the components don't matter. We are not using this build. We are using this build. The other build was for some other Warframe builds. Sorry, that's my bad. This build, the reason why we're using Hound is for Repo Audit here. It's Loki's 4th ability. Exactly, yes. Loki's 4th ability is a companion's ability. Yes, Loki is fantastic. Yes, I know. So this ability will disarm enemies within 30 meters when it has a 20-second cooldown. This is good for us as disarmed enemies will then have to actually come at us, meaning they'll be grouped, they'll run into our tornadoes and be grouped up by them without us having to spam our second too often. Mystic Bond is used as it will give us a free ability cast when every 5 times the companion uses an ability. This isn't as effective as say if you were using it on Duragar, which would basically make it so you never have to cost any energy ever. But it's still pretty effective to the point that I didn't have to run Primed Flow or Archon Energize or anything like that on Zephyr, and I don't have any economy issues at all. Manifold Bond is of course used to lower the cooldown for Repo Audit. Synth Deconstruct for extra health orbs, which does synergize with the Archon Shard we have on the build. Shield Charger is honestly not needed, but it will increase our shield gate if we have to rely on it for Eximus units. Evasion Denial is just for some extra survivability for our companion. Linked by Vitality and Linked Direction, again, is for some survivability for our companion. Vacuum is a must-have. And we are using Aerial Bond just to lower our companion's recovery time whenever we get airborne kills, which obviously we will be doing a lot with Zephyr. Now, since Manifold Bond does apply the status effects of our companion's weapon to enemies with an area when it activates an ability, you have to be careful with this build, as we don't want to be crowd controlling enemies. We want them to come into the tornado, otherwise it will affect our KPM. So we are only running Viral to increase the damage from our slash status effect. We aren't running Heat, Toxic, or Radiation, which are the other elements you could run with Viral, as all of them will crowd control enemies and will cut into a KPM. I am running Melee Power S to further increase the status chance with Healing Return. I'm unsure if Healing Return will actually let the companion heal itself, but either or, if it doesn't, oh well, if it does, fantastic. For the Archon Shard, I am running a Violent Archon Shard to give me that weaker equilibrium effect, which further helps me with my energy economy, and this is the only thing I ever needed when it comes to energy economy. You could probably actually run the build without it. I just have it because I have a backup form of energy regen in case I can't rely on Mystic Bond for whatever reason. For utility weapons, run whatever rifle you want. I do recommend rifle for your primary, so you can mod on Amalgam Serration for the movement speed. And for the melee, I am running Paretos for the sprint, speed, and slide from Evolution 2, and the parkour velocity from Evolution 4. For the focus skill, you can run whatever you want except Naramon, because Naramon's only good for melees. I am running Xeneric for the energy, for the extra free energy cast every 60 seconds and some energy regen. So if you wanted some survivability, would go Vazarin. Armor strip, you'd go for Yonaru. Casting speed or a bit more power strength, you'd go for Matarai. So of course the focus skill is up to you, but I think Xeneric does work up to be the best one for this build. I do run Xeneric on most of my builds, but that's just for ease of starting a mission, giving all the energy I need to start my damage rotation. Even though Xeneric might not be the best focus skill for that build most of the time. But this time I actually do think Xeneric is kind of the best one for this build, so I would recommend Xeneric, but it wouldn't matter that much, so you could run whichever one you want. And that is all from my build. If you enjoyed this build, do check out some of my other content. Check out my Twitch channel where I stream Warframe and some other games here and there. Check out my Let's Play. Come join our Discord where we can chat and hang out. I'm in the VC, and you can come and hang out in the VC with me a lot. And we do giveaways and fashion frame contests and all that fun stuff. You can also join my clan through the Discord if you're interested in doing that. And until next time, bye-bye.